Chapter 1. 2:17 a.m. The phone lit up. The number on the screen was one I could dial with my eyes closed. It was Julian. I answered. On the line there was the din of a crowded bar, music and voices tangled together like a pot of boiling porridge. Nora. His voice was slurred, laced with alcohol. Can you come pick me up? I heard myself say, okay, my voice lighter than the night. Get dressed, grab the keys, go out. I had done this routine countless times, as practiced as breathing. From high school until now, 16 years, one call from Julian, and I was always there. The taxi stopped at the usual place, the bar in the west of town he frequented. I pushed the door open, the smell of smoke and alcohol hit me, and I found him in a corner. He was sprawled over the table, a few empty bottles in front of him, his hair a mess, his shirt collar open, looking like a dog soaked in the rain. Julian. I walked over and gently tapped his shoulder. He looked up, his eyes red. The moment he saw me, he gave a smile. Nora, you're here. I'm here. I always will be. I helped him to his feet, his weight pressed against my shoulder, his warm breath brushing the side of my ear. I smelled the scent of alcohol on him, and a faint perfume, not mine. Never mind. I in the taxi, he leaned against the back seat, eyes closed, and suddenly spoke. Nora. I miss Yvonne so much. Outside the car window, the streetlights receded one by one, their orange glow flickering across his face. I watched his profile, the face I had looked at for 16 years, and suddenly felt a stone lodged in my throat. When he said my name, I thought I had finally waited long enough. Unfortunately, after saying my name, he was still talking about someone else. The first time I saw Julian was on the day of our first year of junior high. September sunlight streamed through the window. He was sitting in the third row by the window, head bowed as he flipped through a comic book. The sunlight fell on his eyelashes, as if gilding them with a rim of gold. I stood at the classroom door, frozen. That was the first time in my 12 years that someone made my heart race. What did that feeling resemble? Like stepping into a warm room in winter, like taking the first bite of watermelon in summer, like all the good things happening at once. Later I learned that feeling is called a crush, but being moved was only the beginning. The following 16 years were a long, silent one-man show. We were best friends. How nice that phrase sounds, intimate, lasting, irreplaceable. But only I knew what best friends really meant. It meant he could call me at 2 in the morning for a pickup. It meant he could cry another girl's name in front of me. It meant he could say, "You are the most important person to me," and then turn around and chase someone else. The most important person, but not the one I love most. Between those two is a distance I spent 15 years walking without taking a single step closer. In high school, Julian began to pursue Yvonne. Yvonne was the most beautiful girl in our grade. Her long hair reached her waist, she had 2 shallow dimples when she smiled, and she spoke softly, like a spring breeze. The first time Julian saw her, he was completely stunned, just like I was the first time I saw him. It turned out that infatuation could be contagious, only in different directions. He courted Yvonne for a whole semester, leaving milk on her desk every morning, waiting for her at the school gate when it rained, holding up the biggest cheer sign at the sports meet. I stood beside him, helping him come up with ideas, handing him milk, writing love letters. Those love letters I wrote to him ultimately became the ones he wrote to someone else. "You really are my best brother," he said, patting my shoulder. I smiled and said nothing. A brother. The word is like a blunt knife, it draws no blood, but every cut still hurts. Yvonne eventually agreed to him. That day Julian was as happy as a child. He ran over, grabbed me and spun me around. "Nora." She said yes. I was in his arms, breathing in the scent of laundry detergent on him, thinking, as long as you're happy. As long as you're happy. I told myself this for 15 years. In college, we were admitted to the same school. Julian and Yvonne broke up and got back together, fighting then making up then fighting. Every time they broke up, Julian came to me. We sat at the barbecue stall behind the school gate. He drank beer, I drank cola, listening to him tell me how great Yvonne was, how ruthless, how he couldn't let her go. "Why won't she just be with me properly?" he asked me, eyes reddened. I didn't know. I only knew you did too, but I said nothing. I just handed him tissues, called him a car, and when he drunkenly slumped over the table, I sat quietly by his side, waiting for him to wake. Once he was so drunk he leaned on my shoulder and, half delirious, said, "Nora, I wish someone would treat me the way you do." My heart gave a sudden jolt. I said softly, "Yes, there are." He didn't hear. He had already fallen asleep. After graduation, we stayed in the same city. Julian got into a pretty good company, and I also found a fairly stable job. We lived in the same neighborhood. He still habitually turned to me, asking me to help when he moved, asking me to bring medicine when he was sick, asking me to bring him food when he worked late. I never refused. It's not that I didn't want to refuse, I didn't know how to refuse. 15 years of habit had grown into my bones. When he frowned, my heart ached. When he spoke, I nodded. I was like a machine with a preset program: input, Julian needs me; output, I'm coming. Our friends all saw it. When are you finally going to tell him? My best friend Lily asked me more than once. What good would it do? I smiled. He doesn't like me. How do you know? You never tried. Because there's never been me in his eyes. I looked out the window. When he looks at Yvonne, his eyes light up. When he looks at me, his eyes are just. Lily sighed and said nothing more. At this moment, at 3 in the morning, I helped Julian into his apartment. He was half drunk and half awake, collapsed on the sofa, still muttering Yvonne's name. I took off his shoes, covered him with a blanket, and poured a glass of water to place on the coffee table. Having done all this, I stood in the living room, looking at his face. I have looked at this face for 16 years. From boyhood to young manhood, from awkwardness to maturity, I remember every subtle change. But he never knew that someone had looked at him this way. I reached out and lightly touched his hair. Good night, Julian. I turned and left, gently closing the door. The motion sensor lights in the hallway blinked on and off and on. I leaned against the wall, slowly sank to my knees, and buried my face in them. I did not cry. After 15 years, I'm very good at holding back. Chapter 2. Julian and Yvonne broke up again. It was their 6th breakup, or 7th, I can't remember. There had been so many, just like the times they'd made up, that they no longer seemed worth counting. The message came in the early hours, just one sentence: we're breaking up. I stared at the screen for 3 seconds, then started getting dressed. Lily said I was sick. It's 3 in the morning, Nora, you have work tomorrow. She lowered her voice on the phone, sounding both angry and worried. What does his breaking up have to do with you? He's alone out there. He's 29, not 9. I know. I took the keys and headed out, but I'm still going. Lily stayed silent on the other end for a long time, and finally said, this isn't love, it's an illness. I didn't answer. Maybe she was right. But 15 years of illness isn't something you can heal just because you want to. I found Julian in that familiar bar. He was sitting at the counter with a row of empty glasses in front of him, his tie hanging crooked around his neck, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, radiating a kind of disheveled handsomeness. Even so, there were girls sneaking glances at him. Julian was that kind of person. He didn't have to do anything, just sitting there. People wanted to get close to him, and I was the one who was always close to him, yet could never reach his heart. You're here. He saw me, his eyes brightening for a moment, then dimming again. Made you come out again? It's fine. I sat down beside him. How much have you had? Not much. He shook the glass in his hand, the ice clinked crisply. Nora, why do you think she leaves every time? Because you're not worth it. The words rolled around on the tip of my tongue, then I swallowed them back. Maybe she just needs time, I said. Time? He smiled bitterly. How much time have I given her? 6 years, on and off for 6 years. What does she actually want? 6 years. The 6 years you spent on and off were the 6 years I stayed by your side. Every time you got drunk, every time you cried, every time you called in the middle of the night saying, I miss her so much, I was the one who answered, but you never knew. Julian, I hesitated. Have you ever thought, maybe you two aren't right for each other? He turned to look at me, his expression suddenly serious. Not right for each other, he repeated, as if chewing over the words, but I really do love her. I lowered my head and stared at the beads of condensation on the bar. I said, I know. I know you love her very much. Just like I love you. But you never knew. That night I stayed with him until 4 in the morning, called a car for him, and took him home. He leaned against the back seat of the taxi, his head tilted to one side, and suddenly reached out to grab my sleeve. Nora. Do you think it's possible for someone to love another person forever, but that person never knows? My heart skipped a beat. He looked at me, his gaze hazy, like drunken words, and like true words spoken soberly. It will. I said, my voice very soft, it definitely will. He let go of my sleeve, closed his eyes, and mumbled, that's really pitiful. Really pitiful. I looked at his profile illuminated by the streetlight and suddenly felt a sting in my eyes. Yes, how pitiful. The next day, I made a decision. I decided to test the waters. It wasn't a confession, I didn't have that kind of courage. It was just a test, like a cat reaching out its paw, gingerly touching the surface of the water to see if it would drown. On the weekend, I asked Julian out to dinner. Not to the barbecue place he often went to, but to a nice Western restaurant with warm yellow lighting and soft music. The kind of place for saying things you can't normally say. I even wore a new dress. Lily helped me pick it out. She said the dress made me look, not like one of the guys, but like a woman. When Julian arrived, he was wearing an old t-shirt and jeans, his hair a mess, clearly just woken up. He froze for a moment when he saw my dress. Why are you dressed so nicely today? Can't I dress nicely? I smiled, my heart was pounding like a drum. You can, it's just. I'm not used to it. He scratched his head and sat down. You order, I'll eat anything. Anything. He would always say anything to me, because in his mind I was never someone to be taken seriously as an option. During dinner I racked my brains for conversation topics, trying to steer the atmosphere towards something more ambiguous. Have you ever thought about what kind of person you want to be with in the future? I asked, pretending to be casual. His hand paused mid-cut on the steak, then he smiled. I haven't thought about it. Right now I just want to be alone. You can't be alone forever. Then tell me, what kind of person is suitable for me? He looked up at me, his eyes filled with genuine confusion. I took a deep breath. Someone who treats you well, I said, someone who always treats you well, who won't leave you no matter what. Julian looked at me, and suddenly smiled. Isn't that you? He said, you've always been the kindest to me. My heart tightened suddenly. Yes, I looked at him, it's me. He froze for a moment, then looked away and picked up his cup to drink. Silence. Long, suffocating silence. I finally understood. It wasn't that he didn't hear me, he didn't want to understand. Nora, he set his cup down and looked at me seriously, you are my best friend, you know that? Friend. That word again. I don't want to lose you. He continued, you mean too much to me, I don't want anything to change the relationship between us. Anything. Including my feelings. I looked into his sincere eyes and suddenly found it absurd. He was so earnest in rejecting me that he didn't even realize he was rejecting me. He thought he was cherishing a friendship, but in fact he was pushing away someone who had loved him for 15 years. Okay, I heard myself say, I understand. I smiled faintly, picked up my knife and fork, and continued eating. The steak had gone cold, cutting it was hard work, just like my heart at that moment. That night when I got home, Lily called. How did it go? He said I'm his best friend. My voice was very calm, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Nora, Lily's voice was choked with tears, how much longer are you going to wait? I looked out at the night beyond the window, at the myriad lights, none of them lit for me. I don't know, I said, maybe until I stop loving him. What if I never stop? I didn't answer, because I didn't know either, how someone who has loved for 15 years could stop loving. He gave me the best spot, friend. But that spot was exactly enough for me to watch him love someone else. Chapter 3. A month later, I received Yvonne's wedding invitation. The invitation was pale pink, with gold filigree on the cover. Inside, the words were stamped in gold, Yvonne and William, cordially invite you to witness our happiness. William. A name I had never heard before. I stared at the invitation for a long time, my heart racing. It wasn't because the bride was Yvonne, I held no ill will toward her, even felt somewhat grateful. If she married someone else, would Julian finally be able to let her go? If Julian let go, would I finally have a chance? Lily said I was crazy. What are you happy about if she's getting married? She asked on the phone. Because. I hesitated, because Julian might let her go. And then? You'd have your chance? Maybe. Nora, Lily sighed, do you really think that after he lets Yvonne go, he'll choose you? I fell silent. I didn't know. I just didn't want to give up the closest thing to hope I'd had in 15 years. The wedding was set for June, on a Saturday with beautiful sunshine. I spent a whole week picking out clothes. Not because I valued the wedding that much, but because Julian would be going. I wanted him to see me, not the buddy who drank with him in old t-shirts, but a woman. Lily went shopping with me to 3 malls and we finally chose a navy long dress, V-necked, waist-fitted, with the hem just reaching the ankles. She said the dress made me look elegant without trying too hard. Remember, Lily said as she fixed my hair, today you're going to witness someone else's happiness, not steal a wedding. I know. I looked at myself in the mirror. I just want him to see me. Lily said nothing, just sighed. The wedding was held at a garden hotel, white tents, roses carpeting the grounds, the air filled with the scent of flowers and champagne. When I arrived, the guests were almost all seated. I found my seat, next to Julian. He had arranged it. Help me fill the room, he wrote on WeChat, it's too awkward for me to go alone. It would have been more awkward for me to go alone, but I didn't say so. Julian was already in his seat, wearing a dark gray suit, his hair neatly combed, looking much more spirited than usual. He saw me and his eyes lit up for a moment. You today? He looked me up and down. You look very nice. Thank you. I forced my voice to sound calm, but my heart was pounding like a drum. Nice. He said I was nice. 15 years, this was the first time he had ever said that to me. Maybe, there really was a chance. The wedding began. Yvonne, arm in arm with her father, walked slowly under the floral arch. She wore a white wedding dress, her long hair draped over her shoulders, the veil fluttering gently in the wind. She looked like a princess stepped out of a fairy tale. I heard someone nearby whisper, the bride is so beautiful. Yeah, so beautiful. So beautiful that it was impossible to look away, so beautiful that Julian's eyes didn't blink. I stole a glance at Julian. His expression was complicated, nostalgic, regretful, relieved, and something else I couldn't quite read. He was looking at Yvonne the way he did 16 years ago, the first time he saw her, and I was looking at him the way I did 16 years ago, the first time I saw him. The three of us stood in the same time and space, yet lived in three different worlds. When we exchanged rings, I saw Julian's finger tremble slightly. He lowered his head. I didn't know what he was thinking. Maybe about the years of breakups and reconciliations with Yvonne, maybe about why he wasn't the one standing by her in the end. I handed him a tissue. He looked up, saw it was me, and gave a wry smile. "It's nothing," he said, "I'm just a little nostalgic." "I know," I said softly. He looked at me, there was gratitude in his eyes, and also some weariness. "Nora," he said, "thank you for coming with me." "You're welcome," I said, "I'll always come with you." Always. I even felt ridiculous saying that out loud. 15 years of always, what did it get me? A wedding invitation, a seat beside him, thank you for coming with me. But I still wanted to go with him. Even if only as a friend, even if only as a backup, even if only as someone who will never be chosen, because I love him. For 15 years, all my choices have been him. After the wedding ended, the guests began to disperse. Julian stood in the corner of the garden, a glass of champagne in his hand, watching Yvonne and the groom cutting the cake in the distance. I walked over and stood beside him, saying nothing. Sometimes, company matters more than words. After a long silence, Julian spoke. "She got married," he said, his voice a little hoarse. She finally got married. He turned his head to look at me, his eyes showing both relief and a touch of bewilderment. "Nora," he said, "tell me, what should I do now?" I looked at him, my heart beginning to race again. Is this an opportunity? Is this the chance I've been waiting for? "You can." I hesitated. "Start over." "Start over?" He repeated the words, as if pondering their meaning. Yes, I mustered my courage, let go of the past and start anew. He looked at me and was silent for a long time. I thought he would say yes, that he would say, "Then let's start over together," that this story would finally turn a new page. But he didn't. He only smiled and said, "Maybe." Then he set down his champagne glass, patted my shoulder, and said, "Come on, I'll take you home." On the way home, Julian was very quiet. Outside the car window, the streetlights receded one by one, like my 16 years of youth. I stole a glance at him. His profile flickered in the light, his expression calm, impossible to read. "Julian," I couldn't help but say, "are you okay?" He nodded, "I'm fine." "Really? Really?" He turned his head and smiled at me. "Yvonne got married. I should be happy for her." "So you let go?" He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe," he said, "maybe I should have let go a long time ago." I could hear my own heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. "So what are your plans for the future?" I asked cautiously. He thought for a moment and said, "I don't know. I'll focus on working well for now." "Nothing else planned?" He looked at me, confusion in his eyes. "What other plans?" I opened my mouth, trying to say something, but in the end nothing came out. "Forget it. I'll wait a little longer. I've waited 15 years, this moment won't make a difference." I had waited 15 years, and finally his first love got married. I thought the story would truly begin from here. What I didn't know was that the story had already ended before it even began. Chapter 4. A week later, Julian asked me out to dinner. "A friend wants to be introduced to you," he wrote on WeChat. I stared at that message for a long time. Friend. Introduce. Meet. These few words together made my heart suddenly race. Friend? What friend? Male or female? "Why introduce them to me?" I replied. "What friend?" "You'll find out when you get here," he said. "The usual place, 7 o'clock. The usual place. That restaurant we always went to, the one we'd been going to since college. The landlady knew us by now. Almost every time Julian asked me out, it was there. I changed into a different dress, put on light makeup, and arrived 10 minutes early. Julian was already there, sitting by the window with 2 glasses of lemonade in front of him. He saw me and waved. "This way." I walked over and sat down, my eyes sweeping past the spot beside him. No one there. "Where's your friend?" I asked. "Almost here." He glanced at his phone. He said he's stuck in traffic. I nodded and took a sip of the lemonade. The cold liquid slid down my throat, calming my heartbeat a little. Maybe just ordinary friends. Maybe he just wanted me to meet his social circle. Maybe, by the way, Julian suddenly said, "Do you remember Yvonne?" My heart clenched. "I do," I said. "Didn't she get married?" "Yes, she's married." He nodded. "She has a younger brother, named Theo. He's a good guy, you two should get along." I froze. A younger brother. Yvonne's younger brother. Theo. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what that sentence meant. The friend he introduced to me was Yvonne's younger brother. "You." I heard my voice a little dry. "You're introducing me to Yvonne's younger brother?" Yeah. He looked at me, his gaze easy as if it were obvious. Theo just returned to the country and doesn't have many friends here. I thought you two are about the same age and your personalities would match, so why not meet? Our personalities would match. Our personalities match. He wanted to pair me up with Yvonne's brother. My head was buzzing, as if something inside was slowly shattering. Nora. Julian looked at me. Are you okay? I'm fine. I heard myself say, I'm fine. At 7:10, Theo arrived. He pushed the door open and walked in just as I looked up. Tall, neat short hair, a white shirt, jeans. He looked very fresh. His eyes were bright, and when he smiled there was a faint curve at the corners of his mouth that made you feel at ease. Sorry, traffic. He came to our table, his voice gentle. Have you been waiting long? No, just arrived. Julian stood up. Theo, this is the Nora I told you about. Nora, this is Theo. Theo looked at me and reached out his hand. Into. I stood up and took his hand. His hand was warm and held mine gently, as if tending to my rhythm. Hi, I said, I'm Nora. We sat down and began to order. Julian and Theo talked about things I couldn't join in on, Yvonne's wedding, friends they had in common, Theo's life abroad. I sat beside them, listening quietly, nodding now and then, smiling. By the way, Theo suddenly turned to me. Julian said you work over here. I nodded. At an advertising agency. An advertising agency? His eyes lit up. I used to do advertising too, in London. Really? I was a bit surprised. How did you end up doing advertising? Fun. He smiled. Later I switched careers, but I still really like that industry. We started talking about advertising, about creative work, about those clients you love and hate. Julian listened from the side, chiming in occasionally, but most of the time it was just Theo and me. Theo was great at conversation. He didn't steer every topic back to himself like Julian. He listened carefully until I finished, then responded, each question perfectly timed. I realized I had actually laughed a few times. A real laugh, not the kind you force out of politeness. While we were eating, Julian suddenly said, you two seem to be having a good time. Yeah. Theo nodded. Nora is fun. Fun? Julian looked at me, something in his eyes I couldn't read. How come I never noticed? I lowered my head, kept eating, and said nothing interesting. I've been by your side for 16 years, and you never found me interesting. He knew me for one day and said I was interesting, but you never once considered that maybe it's because you never really looked at me. Nora is a very good person, Theo said, his voice earnest. I'm glad to have met her. I looked up and saw him watching me, sincere warmth in his eyes. I'm glad to meet you too, I said. This was the truth. Theo really was a good person, talking with him was comfortable, and he made me feel respected and seen, but my chest still felt tight and heavy. Because all of this had been arranged by Julian. He arranged for me to meet others, arranged for me to talk to others, arranged for me to be with others. After dinner, Julian said he was going to the restroom, leaving just Theo and me. Julian told me a lot about you, Theo began. Really? I was a little surprised. What did he say? He said you've been his good friend since high school, that he's grateful you've always been there for him. Theo looked at me. He said you're the best person he knows. The best person. That phrase again. Is that so? I smiled. Did he really say that? Theo nodded, then paused. But I'm a little curious. Curious about what? I wonder why you were willing to stay with him all this time. His eyes were clear, without probing, just pure curiosity. 15 years, from high school until now, you've always been there. My heart skipped a beat. We're good friends, I said. Good friends do that. Do they? He looked at me, and there was something in his gaze I couldn't read. Do good friends keep waiting for someone else? I was stunned. Did he know? Or was it just a casual question? I don't understand what you mean, I said, my voice a little dry. Theo looked at me and didn't press further, he just smiled. It's okay, he said. I just feel that you deserve to be cherished. Julian came back from the bathroom and, seeing us still talking, wore a satisfied expression. Did it go well? He asked. Theo stood up. It's getting late, I should go. I'll see you out. Julian said. No need. Theo waved his hand. I'll grab a taxi myself. He turned to me and reached out his hand. Nora, pleased to meet you. I stood up and took his hand. Likewise. He smiled, then turned and walked away. On the way home, Julian drove me. The streetlights outside the car window passed by one, and I watched the night outside, feeling an emptiness in my heart. What do you think of Theo? Julian suddenly asked. He's nice. I said. Right? There was a satisfied lightness in his tone. I told you you'd get along. I didn't say anything. Nora, he continued, Theo is a very good person. He just returned to the country and doesn't have many friends here. You, look after him more. Look after him? I looked after you for 16 years, and now you want me to look after someone else. Okay. I heard myself say, okay. Julian seemed very pleased. Then it's settled, he said. I'll invite you all out another time. I nodded, saying nothing. The night outside the car window grew darker, and my eyes grew increasingly stung that he wasn't unaware that I liked him. He just thought I should find someone else. Chapter 5. When Julian's car stopped downstairs, I didn't get out immediately. We're here, he said. Get some rest early. I unfastened my seatbelt, placed my hand on the door handle, but didn't open it. Nora. He looked at me. What's wrong? I turned my head and looked at his profile. I have looked at this face for 16 years, from boyhood to youth, from innocence to maturity. I thought I knew everything about him, his likes, his habits, the reasons he frowned. But I never understood the person I was in his heart. Julian, I heard my own voice, very soft. Have you ever thought about what? I looked at him, the light fell into his eyes, showing only confusion, not expectation. I opened my mouth, wanting to ask, have you ever thought about why I've always stayed by your side? Have you ever thought that maybe I don't only want to be your friend? Have you ever thought about how crushed I would be if you introduced me to someone else? But in the end, I said nothing. Never mind. I smiled. Good night. Good night. He nodded. Remember to keep in touch with Theo, he just got back and feels pretty lonely on his own. I opened the car door, got out, and didn't look back. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. I sat on the sofa, watching the moonlight streaming through the window, motionless. My phone lit up. It was a message from Julian. Home yet? I stared at my phone for a long time. Home yet? He's always only concerned with these things. Whether I got home, whether I ate, whether I slept well. He worries about me like he does a casual friend, no more, no less. I typed a line, Julian, I have something to tell you. Then I deleted it, then I typed another line, actually I've always. And deleted that too. I opened the chat history with Julian, scrolling up, then up again. The screen was full of messages I had sent. Where are you? I'll pick you up. Remember to eat. It's cold today, wear more. Can't sleep? I'll keep you company. Don't be sad, you still have me. And his replies were always so short, thanks. Okay. Could you do me a favor? It was always me taking the initiative, always me waiting. Waiting for his reply, waiting for him to need me, waiting for him to glance back at me. But he never did. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the city's lights went out one by one, like my 16 years of hope. I thought that if I waited long enough, he would notice me. I thought that if I gave enough, he would be moved. I thought that if I kept being there, he would turn back. But I was wrong. It wasn't that he couldn't see me, he just didn't want to. It wasn't that he didn't know I liked him, he only pretended not to. It wasn't that he couldn't love me, he simply didn't want to. 15 years. 15 years I used all my strength to love someone who didn't love me. I lowered myself into the dust, thinking flowers would bloom there, but in the end, I was only a speck of dust. He introduced me to others, introduced me to the younger brother of his white moonlight, introduced me to someone he'd only known for a day. He didn't even ask me if I wanted that. He just felt I should find someone else. Just as he just felt I should remain his friend. Just as he just felt I would always be there. I picked up my phone and opened Julian's chat. I typed a line, Julian, I like you. I stared at those 6 characters for a long time. Then I deleted them. I typed another line, Julian, I'm tired. I deleted that too. In the end, I sent nothing. I turned off my phone, tossed it onto the sofa, then curled up and buried my face in my knees. I didn't cry. 15 years, I've become very good at enduring, but something inside was breaking, bit by bit. It was 15 years of expectation, 15 years of waiting, 15 years of love. So it turns out a heart dying isn't instantaneous, it's the disappointment accumulated over 15 years finally overflowing. The next morning, when I woke up, the sunlight was already streaming in. I picked up my phone and saw the message Julian sent last night, go to bed early, don't stay up late. There was another one, sent at 3 in the morning, Theo says you're a nice person, let me introduce a few more friends to you. I looked at that message and suddenly laughed, introduce a few more friends for me. He was always arranging things for me, arranging my life, arranging my social circle, arranging who I should meet and who I should be with. But he never knew that I only wanted him. I only wanted him. But he would never give me that. I stood up and walked to the mirror. The me in the mirror had slightly swollen eyes, a somewhat pale face, and looked very tired. 15 years, how many times have I cried for him? How many nights have I waited for him? How many things have I given up for him? I can't remember anymore. All I know is that I don't want to wait any longer. I opened my phone and found Theo's number, the one Julian had insisted I save last night. I hesitated for a moment, then sent a message. Hi, this is Nora. Are you free to grab a meal together? The moment the message went out, I heard something break inside me. It was the last hope. The Last Obsession, Chapter 6. Theo replied quickly. Of course I'm free. What do you want to eat? I stared at the message, stunned for a moment. He asked me what I wanted to eat. For 15 years, whenever I ate with Julian, he decided where to go and what to eat, and I just followed. He never asked me what I wanted. I typed a line, anything, you decide. Then I deleted it. I typed another message, I want to eat Japanese food. This time I didn't delete it, the message sent, and Theo replied instantly, okay, I know a good place. Saturday at 7 p.m. Saturday at 7 p.m. He set the time and the place, but he asked for my opinion. The feeling was unfamiliar, yet very pleasant. On Saturday night, I arrived at that Japanese restaurant on time. Theo was already waiting at the door, wearing a light blue shirt, his hair neat, looking clean and gentle. Nora. He saw me and his eyes brightened. You're here. I nodded. Have you been waiting long? No, just arrived. He smiled. Come on, let's go inside and sit. We walked into the shop and found a table by the window. The lighting was warm and yellow, the music soft, and there was a faint scent of wood in the air. This place's sushi is pretty good, Theo said, you should try it. Okay. I nodded. He picked up the menu and handed it to me. You look first, order whatever you want. I took the menu, a little stunned. He wanted me to look first, to order first. Aren't you ordering? I asked. I'll eat anything, he smiled, just order what you like. What I liked. He wanted me to order the dishes I liked. I lowered my head, looked at the menu, and suddenly felt my eyes sting a little. While we were eating, Theo kept looking for things to talk about. He asked me how work was going, what kind of movies I liked, and what I usually did on weekends. Every question was about me, not about himself. You seem very concerned about me, I said. Of course. He looked at me, his gaze very serious. I want to get to know you. Get to know me? I was a little surprised. Why? Because you're interesting. He smiled. Also, Julian says you're a very good person. Julian. That name made my heart skip a beat. What did Julian tell you? I asked. He said you've been his good friend since high school, that you take good care of him, that you're a very reliable person. Theo looked at me. But I don't think he said enough. Not enough? I was stunned. He only said you were good to him, Theo said, but he didn't say what kind of person you are. What you like, what you dislike, what your dreams are, what troubles you. He only treated you as a good friend, not as a whole person. My heart clenched sharply. He described me as a whole person. Not Julian's friend, not the one who takes care of him, but myself. You? I looked at him. How do you know these things? Because I've been watching you. Theo said, that night at dinner, I noticed you rarely spoke first, you were always listening to Julian. When you smiled, there was no light in your eyes. It was like you were constantly playing a role instead of being yourself. I lowered my head and said nothing. Nora, Theo's voice was gentle, you don't need to play any role. In front of me, you can be yourself. Be myself. This phrase, like a beam of light, shone into my dark heart. After dinner, Theo suggested going for a walk. We walked slowly along the street as the streetlights came on one by one, the night breeze brushing past, the air faintly scented with flowers. Why are you willing to go out with me? Theo asked suddenly. I was taken aback. Because. I hesitated, I want to try. Try what? Try. I lowered my head, try to let go. Theo didn't speak, he just sat with me quietly. After a long time, he spoke. Let go of what? I looked at him. His eyes were clear, no probing, no questioning, only simple curiosity. Let go of a person, I said, someone I've loved for 15 years. A flicker of surprise passed through Theo's eyes, but he quickly regained his composure. 15 years, he said. That's a long time. I nodded. A long time. So, have you let it go now? I was silent for a moment. I don't know, I said, but I want to try. Theo looked at me, his eyes full of gentleness and a little bit of pity. Nora, he said, letting someone go doesn't mean you stop loving them right away. It means you learn not to place all your hopes on them. Not placing all my hopes on him. That sentence was like a key, opening a door in my heart that had been locked for a long time. I looked at him. I don't know what to do. It's okay. Theo smiled. You can learn slowly. I'll stay with you. Stay with me. He said he would stay with me. Not because I needed him, not because I was useful to him, but simply because he wanted to. When the walk ended, Theo saw me down to the building entrance. Thank you, I said. I had a great time tonight. Me too. He looked at me. Shall we go out together again when you're free next time? Okay. I nodded. He smiled, then turned and walked away. I stood at the foot of the stairs, watching him walk away, and suddenly felt something in my heart quietly beginning to sprout. It was a feeling I hadn't had in a long time, being seen, being respected, being treated as a whole person. Theo was the first to ask me, "Are you okay?" and to actually wait for an answer. Chapter 7. In the days that followed, Theo often asked me out. Sometimes it was for a meal, sometimes to see a movie, sometimes just to walk in the park. He never asked about Julian, and he never pushed me to let him go. He simply stayed quietly by my side, listened to me, and looked into my eyes. Gradually, I found myself beginning to look forward to seeing him. "Lily," I said on the phone one day, "I think I kind of like Theo." "You've only known each other for a month?" Lily's voice sounded a little surprised. "Are you sure?" "I don't know," I said. "Being with him feels comfortable. I don't have to play a part, I don't worry about saying the wrong thing, I don't have to keep waiting for him to reply." "Nora," Lily's tone softened, "this is what a normal relationship is." A normal relationship. That sentence stunned me. For 15 years, I always thought love meant waiting, giving, humiliation, and heartache. I believed loving someone was lowering myself, lower and lower, down into the dust, but Theo showed me that love didn't have to be like that. One night, I worked late and only realized it was pouring when I left the office. I stood at the doorway, watching the torrential rain, feeling a little worried. I hadn't brought an umbrella, there was a line for taxis, and the bus stop was too far away. My phone suddenly rang. It was Theo. "Where are you?" His voice sounded a little anxious. "I'm at the office." "What's up?" "It's raining." "Did you bring an umbrella?" "No." "Stand there and don't move. I'll pick you up." "What?" "No need, I'll take a taxi." "Taking a taxi means waiting in line," he said. "I'm nearby, I'll be there in 10 minutes. Wait for me." 10 minutes later, Theo appeared at the company entrance. He was holding a black umbrella, his hair slightly damp from the rain and his clothes a bit wet, but his eyes were bright, and when he saw me a smile lifted the corner of his mouth. "Let's go, I'll walk you home." I looked at him and suddenly felt a sting in my eyes. For 15 years, whenever it rained, I either held my own umbrella or ran through the rain. Julian never came to pick me up, he didn't even know whether I had an umbrella, but Theo came. He was nearby, he saw the rain, and the first person he thought of was me. "How did you know I didn't have an umbrella?" I asked. "I didn't know," Theo said, "I just wanted to check. If you had an umbrella, I'd be relieved. If you didn't, I'd come get you." The sentence was like a cup of hot tea, warming my heart. On the way home, Theo kept tilting the umbrella toward me. I glanced at his shoulder, already half soaked by the rain. "Your clothes are wet," I said. "It's fine." He smiled. "As long as you don't get wet." "But, Nora," he looked at me, his expression serious, "you don't need to worry about me. I just wanted to keep you from getting wet." I lowered my head and said nothing. For 15 years, I had been used to taking care of others, used to putting other people's needs first. I wasn't used to being cared for, wasn't used to being put first, but Theo showed me what it felt like to be cared for. By the time I got home, the rain had already stopped. Theo stood at the doorway, watching me come inside. "Thank you for bringing me back," I said. "No need," he smiled, "get some rest early." I nodded, about to close the door, when he suddenly spoke. "Nora." He looked at me, his eyes gentle and a little nervous. He paused, "I like you." I was stunned. "Not because you need someone with you, not because I want to take advantage of a moment," he said, "it's because I like you as a person. I like talking with you, I like seeing you smile, I like knowing how your day went. I want to be with you." I looked at him, my heart racing. I didn't know what to say. "You don't have to answer me now," Theo said, "I just want you to know how I feel. You can take your time, go slowly. I'll wait for you." He will wait for me. That sentence suddenly made my eyes sting a little. For 15 years, I had been waiting for someone else. Waiting for Julian to turn back, waiting for Julian to see me, waiting for Julian to fall in love with me. Now, finally, someone was willing to wait for me. That night, I lay in bed, tossing and turning, unable to sleep. Theo said he liked me. He said he wanted to be with me. He said he would wait for me. I picked up my phone and opened my chat history with Julian. The last message was from him. "Theo said you seem like a nice person, let me help introduce a few more friends to you." I looked at that message and suddenly laughed. He wanted me to meet others, not knowing I had already found someone willing to wait for me. I closed Julian's chat and opened Theo's. I typed one line, "Theo, I want to be with you too." Then I pressed send. The next day, Theo came to pick me up from work. When he saw me, his eyes shone like stars. "I read the message you sent last night many times," he said. "Each time I felt so happy." I smiled and said nothing. He reached out and took my hand. "Nora," he said, "I'll treat you well." I looked at him, into his eyes, and suddenly felt something in my chest finally settle. "I know," I said. "I trust you." He smiled, a very happy, childlike smile. Let's go, he said, let's get something to eat. What do you want? Hot pot. Okay, hot pot. We walked hand in hand, walking in the sunlight. It took me 15 years to learn how to love someone. Theo taught me what it meant to be loved with a single sentence. Chapter 8. 3 months later, I moved into Theo's apartment, not because I needed a place to live, but because I wanted to be with him. Waking up each morning and seeing him, coming home each night to someone waiting for me, the feeling was strange, yet very comforting. Theo's apartment wasn't big, 2 bedrooms and a living room, but it was clean and cozy. He gave me the master bedroom and took the smaller one himself, saying, "You can move in whenever you want. I'll wait until you're ready." I'm ready. I want to live with him, eat with him, watch sunsets with him, and spend every ordinary day together. On the first day I moved in, Theo left a light on for me. He gets off work earlier than I do. When I got home, the living room light was on, and there was a bowl of hot porridge and a plate of fruit on the table. You're back. He came out of the kitchen holding a plate. I made a little dinner, eat first. I looked at the porridge on the table and suddenly felt a little dazed. For 15 years, I had gotten used to cooking for Julian and bringing him meals, used to asking him, "Have you eaten?" I had never been cared for like this, someone waiting for me at home, someone leaving the light on for me, someone cooking for me. You? I looked at him. How did you know what time I'd come back? I didn't, Theo smiled. I just made dinner and waited for you to come eat. In case you came home early, you wouldn't have to wait hungry. In case you came home late, the porridge could stay warm. In case you came back early, in case you came back late. He thought through every possibility, also I wouldn't go hungry. I lowered my head and took a sip of congee. The warm liquid slid down my throat and warmed my heart. The days of living together were not what I had imagined. I thought living together would be romantic, waking up to see each other every morning, watching TV together every night. But in reality, living together is mundane. It's about daily chores and provisions, about who washes the dishes, who cooks, who cleans, but Theo handled these little things very well. He remembered that I don't eat cilantro and would pick it out every time he cooked. He remembered I liked to drink warm water and would pour me a cup every morning. He remembered I was afraid of the dark and would leave a light on whenever I came home late from work. Once, out of habit, I brought him a cup of coffee. Bringing Julian coffee used to be my routine. Theo took the coffee, looked at me, and his eyes held warmth and a little bit of pity. "Nora," he said, "you don't have to bring me anything." "Why?" I was a little surprised. "You don't like coffee?" "I do," he said, "but I don't want you to get into the habit of taking care of me. You took care of Julian for 15 years, now I want you to learn what it's like to be cared for." I looked at him and suddenly felt my eyes sting. "Theo," I said, I don't know how to be taken care of." "It's okay," he smiled, "you can learn slowly. I'll teach you." He picked up his coffee, took a sip, then said, "Next time, let me bring it for you." In the 3rd month of living together, I found myself beginning to laugh. Not the kind of smile forced for politeness, but a real laugh, from the heart. I began to become myself again. I picked up the hobbies I had abandoned because of my secret crush on Julian: painting, reading, running. I started to care about my own feelings, not just other people's. One day, Theo came home from work and saw me sitting on the sofa painting. "What are you painting?" He walked over and sat down beside me. "A landscape." I said, "I used to love painting, but then, what happened after that?" "I was busy taking care of Julian, so I didn't have time to paint." I lowered my head. I thought painting wasn't important, I thought taking care of him was more important. Theo looked at me, his eyes full of pity. "Nora," he said, "taking care of others is important, but taking care of yourself is more important. You deserve to do what you love. You deserve to do what you love." That sentence was like a beam of light, illuminating a corner of my heart. "Thank you, Theo," I said. "You're welcome," he smiled. "I just want you to know that you matter." In the 5th month of living together, Theo suggested we take a trip. "Where to?" I asked. "By the sea," he said. "You said you liked the sea." "I like the sea." He remembered what I had said. For 15 years, Julian never remembered what I said. He only remembered what Yvonne liked, disliked, and where she wanted to go. He never really listened to me, but Theo remembered. He remembered that I like the sea, that I don't eat cilantro, that I'm afraid of the dark. "Okay," I said, "let's go to the seaside." Those days at the seaside were the happiest I'd been in a long time. We lay on the sand, watching the sunrise and sunset, watching the waves roll in. Theo held my hand and said, "Nora, you look so beautiful when you smile." "Beautiful?" I was a little surprised. He said, "when you used to smile, there was no light in your eyes. Now there is." I looked at him, and suddenly felt as if something inside me had finally become whole. "Theo," I said, "thank you." "For what?" "Thank you for showing me that the right person would never make you feel like a backup." He looked at me, his eyes gentle and resolute. Nora, he said, you are not a backup. You are my only choice. After returning from the trip, I found that I had truly changed. I began to smile, to do the things I loved, to care about my own feelings. I no longer stared at my phone every day waiting for Julian's messages, and I no longer spent whole days aching over a single thing he said. Lily said I had changed. You used to be like a shadow, she said, and now you're like a real person. A real person. That line made me laugh. For 15 years I lived in Julian's shadow, waiting for him to turn around, waiting for him to notice me. I thought loving someone meant putting myself as low as possible, down in the dust, but Theo taught me that the right person won't make you feel like the alternative. Chapter 9. Julian discovered that Theo and I were together at a friend's party. It was Lily's birthday. She had invited many friends, including Julian, and also me and Theo. When we walked into the party, Julian happened to be standing at the door. He saw me and his eyes lit up for a moment, then he noticed Theo holding my hand and his expression suddenly froze. Nora. He looked at me, his voice a little dry. You and Theo are together? I nodded. We've been together 5 months. 5 months. He didn't know. He didn't know I'd moved into Theo's apartment, didn't know Theo and I had been to the seaside, didn't know that now I laugh and do the things I like. All he knew was that I no longer called him. 5 months. He repeated, as if digesting the information. Why didn't you tell me? Why tell you? Theo spoke, his voice very calm. This is Nora's private matter. Julian looked at him, surprise in his eyes, and a little anger too. She's my friend, he said. I should know about her affairs. Friend? Theo looked at me, tenderness in his eyes. Do you treat her as a friend, or as a backup? Spare tire. The word changed Julian's expression. Theo, he said, his voice a little urgent, you don't know what's between us. I know, Theo said, I know Nora has stayed with you for 15 years, I know you go to her every time you break up, I know you introduced her to me and asked her to look after me. Did you know she likes you? Julian was stunned. She likes me? He looked at me, shock and confusion in his eyes. Nora, yes, I looked at him, my voice very calm. I like you. I've liked you for 15 years. 15 years. When he heard that word, his expression suddenly grew complicated. Surprise, confusion, guilt, and a little regret. Nora. He looked at me. Why didn't you tell me? I told you, I said. After Yvonne's wedding, I tested you. You said I was your best friend, that you didn't want to lose me. He was stunned. He opened his mouth, trying to say something, but in the end he said nothing. After the party, Julian stopped me. Nora, he said, let's talk. Talk about what? I looked at him. About us. His voice sounded a little urgent. I need to know why you suddenly are with Theo. Suddenly. He thought me being with Theo was sudden, but he didn't know I had waited for him for 15 years, that my heart had died from waiting, and only then did I decide to try another path. Julian, I said, I have nothing to talk to you about. I liked you, but you didn't like me. Now I like someone else, and you need to let go. Let go? He looked at me, shock in his eyes and a little anger as well. You want me to let go? You've been by my side for 15 years, and now all of a sudden you say you like someone else and tell me to let go. It isn't sudden, I said. It's 15 years worth of disappointment finally overflowing. He froze. Disappointed. He repeated, you're disappointed in me? Yes. I looked at him, I'm disappointed you never see me, disappointed you introduce me to others, disappointed you only treat me as a best friend, and not as a whole person. He lowered his head and said nothing. After a long time, he spoke. Nora, he said, his voice a little hoarse, I didn't know. I didn't know you liked me. You don't know? I looked at him. Or are you pretending not to know? He froze. Julian, I said, it's not that you don't know. It's that you don't want to know. You enjoy me being with you, you enjoy me taking care of you, but you don't want to take responsibility. You treat me like someone who will always be there, like someone who doesn't need a response. But I'm not. He looked at me, his eyes full of guilt and regret. Nora. He said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. That phrase arrived 15 years late. In the days that followed, Julian began contacting me frequently. Late night calls, weekend dinner invitations, chance meetings after work. It was as if he'd suddenly realized I mattered and didn't want to lose me. Nora, he said on the phone, I found I can't do without you. Can't do without me. I listened to that phrase and suddenly laughed. Julian, I said, what you can't do without isn't me. What you can't do without is the feeling of having someone with you. No, he said, his voice a little urgent, what I can't do without is you. I find I might like you too. Maybe he did like me too. That word arrived 15 years late, and even then it was uncertain. Julian, I said, do you like me? Or are you only regretting losing me? He was silent. I don't know, he said, I need time to figure it out. He needed time to figure things out. 15 years had passed, and he still needed time to figure things out. Julian, I said, I'm not waiting anymore. I've waited for you for 15 years, that's enough. Julian began to desperately try to win me back. He showed up under my office building, bringing flowers, gifts, and apology letters. In front of friends he said, I regret it, said, I missed Nora, said, I want to start over. My friends were divided into two camps. Some urged me to go back. Julian really regrets it. You waited for him for 15 years, and now he finally sees you. You should give him a chance. Some said I had moved on too quickly. You've been with Theo for only a few months. You used to say you liked Julian and now you like someone else. Aren't you being too fickle? Listening to these comments, I suddenly found it a little ridiculous. 15 years. I waited for him for 15 years. He never saw me, never responded to me, never gave me any hope. Now he's with Theo, and he's starting to regret it, trying to win me back, saying I should give him a chance, but what he doesn't know is that I no longer need his chance. One day, Theo asked me, if Julian is chasing you, would you turn back? I looked at him, my expression very calm. No, I said, I don't love him anymore. Really? Theo looked at me, his gaze warm, with a hint of uncertainty. Really? I said, I loved him for 15 years, spent 3 months letting him go, and 5 months falling in love with you. Now, I just want to be with you. Theo looked at me, his eyes suddenly bright. Nora, he said, thank you. For what? Thank you for choosing me. I looked at him and suddenly smiled. Theo, I said, I didn't choose you. You made me realize I'm worthy of being chosen. He said he couldn't live without me. But what he could never live without was the feeling of having someone by his side, not me. Chapter 10. The last time Julian came to see me was at the cafe Theo and I often went to. That afternoon, the sun was bright and there was a faint aroma of coffee in the air. Theo and I sat by the window, chatting and reading, enjoying a quiet weekend. Theo suddenly looked up toward the door. Nora, he said, Julian is here. I turned my head and saw Julian standing at the door, holding a bouquet of flowers, his expression nervous but hopeful. He came over and stood by our table. Nora, he said, I want to talk to you. Theo looked at me, his eyes both questioning and respectful. He didn't intervene, he just sat quietly, waiting for my decision. Theo, I said, you go sit over there for a while. He nodded, stood up, walked to another table, sat down, and looked out the window. I knew he was waiting for me. Whatever decision I made, he would wait. Julian sat down and put the flowers on the table. Nora, he said, I've been thinking for a long time. Thinking about what? Thinking about my feelings for you. He looked at me, his eyes sincere and full of regret. I realized. I do like you. Like me? That word arrived 15 years late. You like me? I looked at him. Is it that you truly like me, or are you only regretting losing me? It's true, he said, I didn't realize before because I was used to you being by my side. I thought you were just a friend, someone who would always be there. But after you left, I realized how important you are to me. Important. That word was 15 years late. Julian, I said, do you know how long I've waited for you? 15 years. He nodded. I know. Do you know how disappointed I am? He lowered his head and said nothing. Do you know how sad I am? Do you know how much it hurts every time I see you with Yvonne? Do you know how I want to cry every time I pick you up at dawn and hear you speak her name? He looked at me, guilt and tenderness in his eyes. Nora, you didn't know, I said. You never thought about how I felt. You only thought about yourself, about your white moonlight, about your feelings. I was just a supporting role, someone who would always wait by your side. I'm not. He tried to say something, but I cut him off. Julian, I said, when you introduced me to Theo, did you know how much it hurt me? You sent me to take care of someone else, to be with someone else, but you never asked me if I was willing. He froze. I thought you would like Theo, he said. He's a good man, I think you two would suit each other. You think? I looked at him. You only think. You think I should find someone else, you think I should let you go, you think I should stay your friend. But you never asked me what I want. He bowed his head and said nothing. After a long time he spoke. Nora, he said, his voice a little hoarse, I'm sorry. I know I was wrong. I didn't see you before, didn't cherish you, didn't respond to you. Now I want to make amends, I want to start over. Could you, give me a chance? Give me a chance. Those words arrived 15 years late, and they came with uncertainty. I looked at him, into his eyes, at his sincerity, at his regret. 15 years ago, if he had said that I would have been overjoyed. I would have said yes, been with him, placed all my hopes in him. But now, it's different. Julian, I said, I've loved you for 15 years. You have never loved me for a single day. He froze. Now I don't love you, I said, you should learn to let go too. Don't love you anymore. Those words changed his expression. Nora. He looked at me, do you really not love me anymore? It's true, I said. I spent 15 years loving you, 3 months letting you go, and 5 months falling in love with someone else. Now, you're no longer in my heart. He looked at me, his eyes full of shock and unwillingness. But, he said, I regret it. I've realized I like you. You should give me a chance. A chance? I looked at him. Julian, I gave you 15 years of chances. You never treasured them. Now you say you regret it and want me to give you another chance? But I don't need that anymore. You don't need me? He looked at me. You don't need me anymore? Yes. I said, I don't need you anymore. I have Theo, I have myself, I have a new life. You are just the past, a past it took me 15 years to let go of. He looked at me, his eyes full of pain and unwillingness. Nora, Julian, I said, you need to learn to let go. Not all regrets can bring someone back. Not all apologies can make up for 15 years. He lowered his head and said nothing. After a long time he stood up and picked up the flowers on the table. Nora, he said, I won't give up. I'll wait for you, wait for your return. I won't come back, I said. I don't love you anymore, and I won't turn back. He looked at me, his eyes showing both reluctance and helplessness. All right, he said, all right. He turned and walked out of the cafe, disappearing into the sunlight. Theo came over and sat beside me. He left, he asked. I nodded. He left. Theo looked at me, his eyes full of gentleness and also of pain. Nora, he said, are you okay? Yes. I smiled, I'm fine. He looked at me, suddenly reached out and took my hand. Nora, he said, thank you. For what? Thank you for choosing me, he said. Thank you for not looking back anymore. I looked at him and suddenly smiled. Theo, I said, it's not that I won't look back. It's that I no longer have anywhere to look back to. Julian is only the past, you are my present and my future. He looked at me, his eyes shining like stars. Nora, he said, I will stay with you forever. I know, I said, I believe you. We walked out of the cafe, the sun was bright, and there was a faint scent of flowers in the air. Theo took my hand, and we walked slowly along the street. Nora, he said, where do you want to go? Whatever. I said, as long as I'm with you. He smiled and said, then let's go to the seaside. You said you like the sea. Okay. I said, let's go to the seaside. We walked hand in hand, in the sunlight. I glanced back once toward the cafe, then turned and, together with Theo, walked toward the future. I no longer love you. This is not regret, it is freedom.